Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in the AMRI Academy summer series on anti-monopoly and regulated industries. I'm Amy Kapczynski, and let me jump into what we're talking about today. So last week, we did a deep dive into the problem of rising market power. We talked about a kind of old conventional wisdom about how markets would take care of antitrust issues or take care of market concentration problems, we could expect sufficient competition, and that as long as we had sufficient competition, we only needed to police certain kinds of collusion. We talked about the new conventional wisdom, in fact, and some of the evidence that comes from economic statistics in the world around us, that in fact, market power is everywhere, that it is the result of intersecting forces of legal changes, including changes in enforcement and shifts in the law of antitrust, for example, that Sandeep talked to us about, also structural shifts in the economy, the rise of and predominance of information technologies in the most dynamic sectors of the economy, network effects, the impact of regulation, which is in some sense an entailment of a highly complex society. That too has implications, perhaps especially in an information age, on concentration. The impact of more and more concentrated markets and concentrated corporate power is not just on prices, but also, as we mentioned, on innovation, on wages, on politics, on distribution, on democracy at work. And it's all of these things that we want to hold into the frame of our discussions about anti-monopoly and regulated industries. And just again, as a reminder, part of the way that we frame these courses in this conversation is very deliberate. We're not focused on antitrust law, we're talking about anti-monopoly, right? And the stakes of that shift are not just a narrow legal construction, which is antitrust law, but a broad question about the relationship between private and public power, and an anti-monopoly linking up to a tradition that sees the distribution of economic power and political power as importantly connected. And regulated industries are part of our framework because many industries, as we'll be discussing over the course of the summer, have a market power problem. And we'll be talking about industries like pharma, we'll be talking about labor market concentration, and understanding how we need a toolkit and why we need a toolkit to deal with market power and private power that's much broader than just antitrust law, but that runs the gamut from regulatory tools like standard notice and comment regulation to tools like public provisioning or public options. So this session, we're going to zoom out. So the aim here is to teach you the intellectual architecture that greased the wheels for the changes that we talked about last week, and critiques and alternative directions that we might go. We talked about, and Suresh diagrammed for us, rising market power over the last several decades. If we looked at graphs of income inequality, wealth inequality, we would see similar things. So there are some connections between these two. And broadly, one way to think about some of the connections here and the background that helped consolidate these shifts was the predominance around the world of an ideology that I'm going to call neoliberal ideology. And these, and we'll talk about this in some depth today, ideals of government that were broadly shared across political parties. They reshaped institutions, policies, and law. And in a very deep sense, this was also a moral project, one that sought to call into being certain kinds of people, so rational maximizers who are always trading on the margins, economic man, right? Cultivating your own human capital. Many of you younger folks out there grew up, as I did, sort of steeped in this way of thinking about people and what they're for, and the world and what it's for. That very much sought to negate the very idea of the social. Think here of Margaret Thatcher's famous comment that there is no such thing as society, right? And to call into question the very idea of public values. Obviously, part of what we are constructing here is, we hope, an alternative to that. So law is the connective tissue between politics and the economy, and law was therefore a medium through which neoliberal ideas came to shape and, in fact, give birth to neoliberal institutions and policies. So law changes in really important ways over this period of time, over the last several decades, in this sort of trend, in this time trend of rising inequality and corporate power, concentrated markets. So it's not only, though, the law of antitrust. We touched a little bit on the law of antitrust, but also, as we'll be talking about over the course of this summer, the law of corporations, the law of intellectual property, the law of the administrative state, the regulatory state, even constitutional law. So broadly, a neoliberal spirit sort of moved through our law over the last several decades. And we call that, my co-authors and I, the 20th century synthesis. This is not just a story of ideas. Ideas are important, but they're mobilized on behalf of certain interests and with the involvement of deep-pocketed foundations like the Volcker Fund, the Ellen Foundation, and so forth. So I'm going to begin with some definitions. What is neoliberalism as an overarching frame for this shift? What are law and economics in the 20th century synthesis? So how neoliberalism became expressed in law. And then I'm going to describe some key problems with these accounts. So this lecture is also going to function as a very quick and necessarily sparse introduction to law and political economy. But what we want to do is build a series of critical moves that law and political economy scholars are starting to consolidate that you can take with you as we move across different parts of the syllabus and as you move out and take these ideas into the world. And we'll be talking about alternative ideas built on these critiques and constructive moves that we might make as alternatives to this neoliberal way of thinking. All right, let's start with neoliberalism. There are many different definitions of neoliberalism and a contest over what it means. The most common definition, perhaps, in the literature is David Harvey's. This is a quote: "Neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade." So this is the free market, anti-regulatory set of ideas associated with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, the Washington Consensus. It took root in the 1980s as a policy matter. So key examples of neoliberal policies, for example, would include deregulation, the whittling away of the power of labor unions, cap and trade or market mimicking sort of policy moves. So if you see an environmental problem, try to create a market around it. Cost benefit analysis. So the attempt to rationalize different kinds of policy choices through one sort of unitary lens, totting up the sort of costs and benefits in dollar terms. The WTO and trade liberalization, sort of idea that trade liberalization and comparative advantage would increase global economic well-being. The basic idea behind many of these, or the way that they're pitched, is let markets do their work, prevent politics from interfering with markets, and markets are presumptively efficient, right? It draws on neoclassical economics, the tools of marginalism, and so forth. And for more on some of these histories, you've got lots of great resources in the LPE primer on neoliberalism that you also looked at for today. So historians mostly trace these neoliberal kind of forms of governmentality to the Mont Pelerin Society, to people like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan. Important to say, and again, we're not covering obviously the whole history of neoliberalism here, but important to say that it followed on, it was a reaction to the New Deal, to the Trente Glorieuses, right? This sort of period, post-World War II period, where there was relatively strong labor power in many parts of the world, relatively high tax rates, relatively low inequality and social mobility, relatively high social mobility, and a compression of inequality that followed World War II. So this neoliberal turn was aligned against the progressive claims of, for example, the labor movement, the anti-racist movement of the civil rights era, which did have deep historical relationships in many instances. Now I'm thinking here of the United States, relationship to the labor movement. It was also a reaction, this neoliberal turn, against the anti-colonial movement, and Quinn Slobodian's book Globalists is excellent here as an introduction to some of those ideas, right? So what we have here in this period is a revival of the doctrines, in some sense, of classical economic liberalism, also called laissez-faire, in a revival of those ideas, these laissez-faire ideas in politics, ideas, and law. In our next class, we'll have Bill Novak here with us, and he'll be talking more about this laissez-faire period earlier, and particularly the progressive response to it in American history. So notice that the list of policies that I just gave you that are sort of indicative and characteristic of neoliberalism is not a left-right list. The Democratic Party moves towards things like deregulation and cap and trade, perhaps not with the same enthusiasm at all moments, but very much decisively moves in this direction. So you get a consensus on many of these things. So for example, famously, we have a consensus on trade policy and so forth. Sandeep mentioned this in the last class too, on these antitrust issues. This was not a left-right split or a Democrat-Republican split in the United States. So I want to emphasize here, before we move on, a couple of important features of the scholarship on neoliberalism. So early in the literature, neoliberalism tended to be defined as a project of deregulation. And I mentioned that deregulation is a sort of canonical policy prescription in neoliberal terms. So Jamie Peck would call this the rollback. Neoliberalism is rolling back the state. More recent scholarship, in contrast, emphasizes the central role of the state in neoliberal governments. And this is going to be really important to us. So this is not neoliberalism as roll back, but as also roll out. So in fact, there's a selective rollback of the state in some ways and roll out in the other. Why is this critical to us? Because it's part of understanding that, in fact, free markets are constructed by law. Right? So it's not actually very helpful to think of neoliberalism as a freeing of markets or the creation of only a night watchman state, a very small state, right? The famous statement from Grover Norquist in American Politics that he wanted to shrink the American government so small you could drown it in the bathtub. That is not what neoliberalism actually does, although it's the calling card, it's the advertisement. In fact, there's an enormous rolling out of laws that are part of this. And I am a scholar of intellectual property law. It's a classic and wonderful example of this. Intellectual property law is a form of exclusive right that a government grants to a corporation that it enforces against other corporations. And much like other property rights, without the protection of this form, certain kinds of markets cannot exist in the form that they do now. Now, why is that called property and not, for example, regulation? One could call the whole field of intellectual property regulation of information, and yet we don't call it that. We have this sort of special denomination of this as property, and that relates back to a long history that comes out of our common law legal tradition, but also out of laissez-faire that treats property, rules of property and contract, for example, as background rules, but not really as government regulation, but is simply the backdrop to markets. So, so also important in this same period of neoliberal rollout of certain forms of market control, allocating market control to some, coordination rights to some and not others, we also have the rollout of a carceral state, very, very predominantly in the United States, but also elsewhere, militarized borders, right? So it would be strange to see this as a period of government rollback. That's the wrong way to think about it. Rather, it's a rollout and rollback at the same time. Certain people are privileged, certain interests are privileged. The state's deployed on behalf of some rather than others. Second really important thing to understand. The more recent literature on neoliberalism really emphasizes, again, not this as a retreat of the state or a liberation of markets, but as, in fact, an encasement of markets against democratic control. So it's really important, once you start to see that there's a roll out as well as a roll back, right? But that this is a selective deployment of state power, to see that what neoliberalism really embraces is the encasement of certain kinds of market power against democratic control or redistribution. WTO is a very interesting example of that. So for example, I gave you a reading for last week about COVID vaccines and the role of the WTO's intellectual property treaty. That treaty mandates that all states provide patents for medicines, for example. That didn't used to be true prior to the 1990s. And it is very much an assertion of government authority that makes it difficult for countries to determine in their own democratic fashion what form of innovation policy they want to have, and in fact, how they want to adjudicate really critical life and death questions like who is going to get access to COVID vaccines. And so those kinds of encasement, right, that protect, in fact, certain kinds of owners of capital or industrial interests across borders, and protect them precisely from democracy is a really important thing to understand and appreciate about the newer neoliberalism literature. So David Graywall and Jed Purdy, in the piece that we gave you for reading this week, say neoliberalism is an amalgamation of shifting claims that, quote, advance the market side of a contest in capitalist democracies between capitalist imperatives and democratic demands. All right, so that's the kind of democracy point. Now, what's the role of law in this? It's another thing I really want you to appreciate, and it'll be important to understanding this course, is a lot of the literature on neoliberalism doesn't pay a lot of attention to law, but law is really critical, right? It structures political economy, it structures neoliberalism, it acts as a medium, right? So law is shaped by and shapes these policy formations and ideas in ways that we'll be illuminating over the course of our discussions together, using the tools of legal realists, critical legal studies, critical race, and feminist legal scholars, and law and political economy scholars. So that said, there's lots more in the primer for you to read about this historical literature, and I very much urge you to delve into that when you can. So a question came up in the last class, and it came up last summer as well, about whether we should be talking more about, for example, capitalism than neoliberalism. And one way to think about neoliberalism, in fact, is just as the current stage of capitalism. So when I teach in the classroom, in my law and political economy class, where we have more time and we're really focused on sort of unspooling the framework of law and political economy, I start with people like Ellen Wood and Karl Polanyi, and I bring that together with this material on neoliberalism to describe neoliberalism as just the latest form of capitalism. So that syllabus is available on the LPE blog website, along with lots of other great syllabi. And I think it's important, in fact, although I'm not going to say much more about it here, to situate the conversation about neoliberalism in the scholarly work on the history of capitalism. And that's because some of the problems that are the most urgent today, the climate crisis, the extractive and violent relationship of violent nature of relationships between global North and South, the historical forms of dispossession from land to slavery that we're grappling with still through the lens of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and movements all around the world, raising similar themes. Many of these forms of crisis aren't well captured by the conversation on neoliberalism alone. So, for example, as Angela Harris and Jay Varelis write in their excellent introduction to the first issue of the Journal on Law and Political Economy, and this is a quote, neoliberalism's separation of the state from the market was preceded by domesticity's evacuation of social production from the sphere of economic relations. Similarly, the conventional history of capitalism frames land dispossession and the forcible incorporation of subsistence economies into wage-based economies as, quote, primitive accumulation, something that happened in the past, before capitalism proper. And as the new literature on racial capitalism has begun to explore, the carceral state is connected in intricate ways to economic production, distribution, and extraction, as well as to the moral ideologies of discipline and punishment that underpin discourses of work, public assistance, and crime. So we'll talk in our class from time to time, I think, about how the critique of neoliberalism relates to critiques of capitalism, and how concerns about anti-monopoly, in fact, might relate to concerns about the nature of or form of capitalism in which we're living. But this isn't a seminar on law and political economy or on the history of capitalism, but instead on anti-monopoly and regulated industries. And so for our purposes, the idea in focusing on neoliberalism is a good way in, because it does provide us with a good language to talk about some of the changes in the last several decades that have pitched us into the present moment and that accelerated the inequalities and concentrations of power and hollowed out democracy that we are very much grappling with in this course. All right, back to these neoliberal ideas and how they got translated into law. A big component of this, as we stress in our piece that you read for today, or you will read for this week, building a law and political economy framework. So that's the Yale Law Journal piece that talks about the 20th century synthesis. And I'll sketch this out a little bit here. And obviously you read more in the paper, but these neoliberal ideas get translated into law through certain kinds of thinking about economics, and very prominently through law and economics. So The story here again is not just about ideas, but rather mobilization. Law and economics starts at Chicago Law School. That's its spiritual home, if you like. There's a church, it turns out. The first economist at that law school was a libertarian called Henry Simons. And in fact, he helped to arrange the publication in the United States of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Very, very foundational and important work of neoliberal thought. And he worked with Hayek and the Volcker Fund to fund the development of law and economics in Chicago, created an antitrust project as, in fact, the first major intervention of this initiative, and created a journal of law and economics. Olin, Volcker, the Liberty Fund, they funded very impactful programs, including academic fellowships and conferences. A lot of this is sketched out in the Steve Tellis book, which is in your recommended readings, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement. The most famous initiative, in fact, associated with this is the Economics Program for Federal Judges, which at its height, and this is in the Tellis book, in 1990, had hosted 40% of the federal judiciary, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, and 67 members of the federal courts of appeals. Suresh Naidu has a paper, in fact, trying to sort of show econometrically the impact that this had, interestingly, not only on cases involving kind of economics conventionally understood, but also on crime and criminal sentencing. One word of caution about the Tellis. Tellis is kind of enamored of these ideas, and I think he gives a rather crude political economy account. For example, focusing on funders and downplaying the kind of opportunity structures and some of the other conditions of this movement sort of succeeding the way that it did. Okay, so what is law and economics? I think a common definition of law and economics would be the application of tools of neoclassical economics to law. So what does that mean? So you model people as rational maximizers, and you argue that law should seek the efficient outcome because efficiency is good or neutral and is a more tractable way than others of making decisions. So those of you who've already been to a US law school very likely were introduced to these ideas very early on. So you walk into a class about contracts and perhaps you thought, well, we'll learn about agreements, or maybe we'll learn about, whether it's unfair for somebody to try to get you into a subprime mortgage loan. And instead, you're taught very often a language about efficient breach and ways to sort of model what should happen and how the law should decide who has rights, who has entitlements through the lens of efficiency. Okay, so what is efficiency? And by the way, I know many of our students are outside of the United States. This has had some impact, although less in other countries. Interestingly, I think while there's been a sort of less influence of law and economics abroad in earlier years, it seems to be in many places actually having more influence than it ever did more recently. Okay, so what are some of the key ideas of law and economics that will help understand how it formulated this connective tissue between these neoliberal ideas and legal change and legal justification? Okay, one, efficiency is the central value. It's really important to understand what that means. Suresh talked a little bit about this in our first class. Secrets are going to be revealed here, so pay attention. Okay, so what is efficiency? It's common to think that efficiency is something like making good use of resources. And in fact, that's part of the power of this language, is that, like, who could be against that? Like, who wants waste? If I just, take this, a cup of coffee and I dump it on the floor, what a waste. Who wants that? Of course we want to be efficient. That's not what efficiency actually means. What efficiency means, there's a technical meaning for it. In law schools, that meaning is almost always, in law and economics, wealth maximization, right? So the thing that we want to do, the thing that counts as efficient itself is ensuring that things go to the person who's willing to pay the most for them. And what this does is produces maximum consumer and producer surplus, right? What this is formally is a move from Pareto optimality. So if you go into the history of economics or you took microeconomics, you might remember Pareto optimality is a situation where no person can be made better off without somebody else being made worse off, right? That's a very sort of strict Pareto efficiency criteria. It's too strict for the world of law and policy because almost everything we want to do makes somebody worse off. And so rather than use a Pareto criteria, which has more defenders in the world of, I would say, philosophy than Kaldor-Hicks criteria for efficiency, this other efficiency, wealth maximization ideas really, instead of a sort of a criterion of Pareto, what you have is the criterion that says, well, the people who are made better off are so much better off that they could, in theory, pay off the people who are worse off. And this is a sort of idea that gets translated again, in law and economics to essentially a principle that those with the highest willingness to pay should be the ones who get a good, right? So it's really important to see that efficiency understood in this way is not the same thing as happiness or utility, right? Economics comes from a long engagement with utilitarianism, right? The idea that in fact, what we ought to do is the thing that maximizes the sum of pleasure or utility in the world. There's something very important to understand about efficiency as a value, which is that it is not about utility. So let me give you a very concrete example of this. So let's say that I am quite wealthy and a little bit peckish, and over here is a sandwich, and my colleague James here is actually my friend James here is actually starving. I'm willing to pay $10 for that sandwich because I'm a little hungry and I've got it. James is willing to pay or only able to pay $1 because he doesn't get paid until next Tuesday, right? So who gets it, right? In a utilitarian framework that was really about the maximization of pleasure or welfare, he would get it, right? Because it'd be pretty easy to make an assumption that as somebody who was starving or very, very hungry, that he would get more pleasure out of it. Under a wealth maximization framework, I get it. Why do I get it? Because I have higher willingness to pay. And that sort of fundamental idea and the separation of law and economics from welfare and maximizing wealth instead is really important. Why does it happen? Coase has this great line, Ronald Coase, famous in law schools in America also. The great advantage which economics has possessed is that economists are able to use the measuring rod of money. So this is the story about tractability. And well, we don't know what people's preferences are. And so let's figure out how they reveal those preferences. And so let's just look at markets. But of course, there's a really deep problem with this, as we talk about a little bit in the paper, and many others have written about before, which is that there's a sleight of hand, right? The idea that somehow everybody is better off when we give those who have more is actually quite implausible as a moral matter. And there's very little reason to think that wealth maximization is attractive morally. Why should I get the sandwich? Why would that be fair, right? All right, another thing that's very characteristic. So first thing you do is you maximize efficiency. The second thing is you sideline distribution in law and economics. It's always in the shadows or something that comes later. So one manifestation of this in American law schools is taught to many people as the Coase theorem, right? So the idea that when you have to decide who's going to get a right, for example, there's a factory spewing pollution into the air, and the landowners, little community next door. Is it a nuisance? Classic question of tort law. The question, Coase said, is somewhat wrongly put. It doesn't matter where you put the entitlement, if you give it to the factory or you give it to the community, because as long as they can exchange rights, so they can pay one another off and sort of form a contract, the efficient thing will always happen. And so, for example, if you say, well, let's shut down the factory, yes, that's a nuisance. But it's worth it to the factory to continue to pollute. They'll just make a side deal with the landowners and they'll pay them. And if you get it wrong and you say, well, let's give the right instead to the factory, let the factory pollute. If that's wrong and it's really hard on the homeowners, they'll just band together and they'll pool their money and they'll pay off the factory. And that's the Coase theorem, taught in a lot of law schools as a way of talking about why it doesn't matter what the law does. Now, in fact, that's not what. In fact, what Coase said, what he said was that transaction costs do exist in the world. And so, for example, it might be hard for that community to get together and pay off the factory. But what I want you to focus on is not learning the Coase theorem. It's the central move that's made here, which is to say a move that says distribution doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter who pays who, as long as the efficient thing happens. But of course, in the real world, who pays who might be of extraordinary interest to us. All right, but another very kind of key foundational move of law and economics is don't pay attention to distribution, just do what's efficient. And in fact, there's another very important kind of line of work that comes out of people like Louis Kaplow and Steve Chevelle that argues, in fact, that we should always do the efficient thing first, and we should deal with any equity issues later in a tax and transfer sort of, let the tax system deal with that. We distribute later, just do the efficient thing first. Notice how this whole way of talking about things like, is something, is pollution, a certain level of pollution allowed or not, who has the rights, the employee or the employer, avoids all questions of power, prior entitlement, inequality, even questions of justice, and translates them all into the language of efficiency. So you design legal entitlements to maximize willingness to pay. And this comes to be seen in law schools as kind of the obvious way to look at many things, or at least a very plausible, gotta grapple with that question kind of way of looking at things. So, because why else would we want something other than efficiency? How could you not want that? But think about what you can't talk about, right? Distribution, fairness, concentration of power, right? So under an efficiency framework, if everything was held by one company, but that one company was able to, say, produce low prices, that's okay, right? Suresh mentioned this last time, right? Questions about the interaction between economic and political power kind of disappear. Market values beyond market values kind of disappear, right? Elizabeth Anderson is a great person to read in her work on economics about that question, values in economics. Notice also that in this framework, anything that isn't in the economy or measurable through this lens of sort of wealth maximization is systematically marginalized, extracted, not compensated, expropriated. Okay. Another really foundational move in law and economics is the development of something called public choice theory. Many of you, if you're in a US law school, you'll hear words like rent seeking. What does rent seeking actually mean? Have you ever asked yourself that? If you've heard that question, you come to learn the lingo without really being taught many of its earlier entailments. So what this really comes from is what's called public choice theory, is the application of theories of rational choice to government. So we take a government and we say, there's no such thing as a government or a state that seeks to, where people in politics seek to achieve public purposes and realize public values. There's just interest groups, and they're just competition, capture, and rent seeking. So you can model legislators and the amount of time that they spend on something, campaign donations versus other things. You essentially, what you're doing is you're applying market thinking to the state. You're making the state subject to market logics and acting as if that's the only way that one ought to think about the state. So that legislation, for example, is all about just horse trading and interest groups, and one might not even expect that it could operate any differently. And the only question is it concentrated or not, for example. Cost-benefit analysis is part of this same sort of rise of public choice theory. It's sold as rationalizing the costs and benefits of government and of different kinds of policies, and sort of making them all commensurable, and then using the magic measuring rod of money to sort of figure out should we have more regulation over here and less over here? Should we have backup cameras in our cars or not, right? But cap and trade and privatization, all of these other things are also very much kind of consistent with and emerging out of the application of economics to law and the state and government in public choice theory. So these ideas, these law and economics ideas, have big impacts on both public and private law. So as we talked about in the first class, and we'll talk about again, there's big changes that go on in the field of antitrust law, and that was one of the standard bearers for the field of law and economics. There's huge shifts that go on in this period of time in the realm of intellectual property law, and I'll mention a couple of those when we get to the week where I'll be talking about pharmaceuticals. The First Amendment changes in really profound ways. So this is not only about the sort of quote unquote law of the market. The First Amendment changes where we have new commercial speech protections, and I've written about some of how those protections actually borrow very explicitly, although not self-consciously, on neoliberal logics about what markets are like and who subjects are, what the state is like, and what we should worry about from the perspective of the First Amendment. And of course, the money as speech component of American free speech law that really has deconstructed our campaign finance laws as part of the same tradition. All right, so these ideas have big impact, and we sketch out some more of them in our piece. And the result we describe as the 20th century synthesis. So what is that? We argue that throughout all these different fields of law, including some that would seem very disconnected from one another, you see a similar theme, which is the depoliticization and the naturalization of markets and market-mediated inequalities that rest on interrelated developments. So some legal subfields get reoriented around economic efficiency, or at least debates, even if the law itself doesn't really get reformed in this way thoroughly. The debates get reoriented around efficiency as a value. So these are the fields where law and economics has become dominant and are generally thought of as about the market, like contracts, property, antitrust, corporate law, and so forth. But it's not just true in these areas. In the so-called public or political fields of law, we also get a sort of hollowing out and a deference to the market. So questions about class and structural power recede, and we get the adoption of neoliberal ideas about markets. So expecting competition to work, expecting markets to reward virtue and sort of marginal productivity, reconceptualization of the state, worrying about interest groups, right? And coming to see some activities of democracy as sort of unfortunate forms of rent seeking. And reconceptualization of who subjects are, right? So the sort of bringing of, you start to see in First Amendment cases and others, the Supreme Court thinking about people as people who have an interest as consumers more than as citizens, for example. And you'll find some of that in some of the writing I've done on the First Amendment if you're interested. And a pessimism about the effectiveness of the state, about the very possibility of citizenship, and a flipping of conceptions of discrimination from ones that would have recognized and in fact allowed the state or made the state act against historically embedded forms of discrimination, flipping that to a kind of anti-affirmative action agenda that again it kind of encases certain forms of privilege, in this context racial privilege, so white privilege, from in fact democratic reorganization. So democratically passed laws about affirmative action get struck down, for example. And the result, as we say in the Yale Law Journal piece, is the result is a vision of constitutional equality and liberty that enshrines structural inequality and economic power. Okay, so what's wrong with these views? So these are the critical moves of law and political economy. They're very much under construction. And so what I offer here is my take upon them. Others have their own. But here, I think, are some really useful condensations of some of the critiques that are emerging. So neoliberalism is a valorization of free markets. The idea that we have to let markets do their work and prevent politics from interfering with markets because markets are efficient presumptively. But as we'll discuss over the next few sessions, there is no such thing as the free market or even the market in some sense, right? As it's sort of separate thing that has its own rules. So we'll borrow from the legal realists and talk about coercion as central to markets, law as central to the definition of market entitlements, and the choices that are counted as free. So we can talk about the nuisance rules in pollution. Law has to decide, is that belching of smoke into the sky, a tort or not? We could talk about labor law, and we will talk about coordination rights. So who has the right to coordinate with who? Very fundamentally, law is setting up the contours of who can trade and coordinate with others and who has to pay whom for what. So the first critical move of LPE is, and drawing very much on legal realism, is that markets aren't natural, but are constructed by law, so that we decide in politics which kind of markets we want. And there's no natural market distribution, so we decide in politics, and not, as I'll mention in a moment, only thinking redistributively, but also thinking pre-distributively. Okay, a second critical move of law and political economy: efficiency is not neutral. It builds in an accession principle. So the rich get richer, and probably especially in the digital networked age, it concentrates economic power. So this way of organizing things to maximize wealth will move resources to those who have more. And elevating efficiency is the only value that matters is going to displace and demote lots of other important values that historically have been part of our law. So in antitrust law, we sort of gestured at this last time, there's a kind of elevation of consumer welfare and price, right? But an evacuation of the notion that antitrust law had anything to do with the impact on labor or companies being too big to fail, and the political implications of concentrated corporate power for our democracy. So once antitrust law did consider itself engaged with these things, a lot of that was evacuated at the time, right? So efficiency is not neutral, right? It concentrates power, and it reifies the market as a space of choice in a way that naturalizes wealth inequities, which of course are deeply racialized and also gendered. So it makes it hard to question the starting point. You can only redistribute, right? Okay, a third critical move of law and political economy, and here I'm going to point you again to the Angela Harris and Jay Varela's piece in the Journal of Law and Political Economy. Class and economic power is inextricably connected to the development of racial and gender hierarchies, as well as to other systems of unequal power and privilege. So it's impossible to understand or combat economic domination today without understanding and working against the ways in which it's intertwined with and helps to do the work of racism, of sexism, of empire. So law and political economy scholarship is invested in mapping the racial wealth gap, in understanding racialized processes of extraction through law, for example, in mortgage and credit markets or in municipal bonds. It's also invested in mapping how the very definition of the economy and the role of law in defining the economy, what counts as income, what counts as work, is organized in racialized and gendered ways. So, for example, care work is a critically important and growing sector of the economy. A lot of care work is unwaged, simply not recognized as work at all, and counted in things like GDP. All the work that's done in the home, for example. And much of care work that isn't done in the home, that in fact is waged, is poorly paid. These forms of work, there's a whole history of the exclusion of these forms of work from the economy proper or from the mainstream economy. They didn't receive, for example, these kinds of workers, the protection of labor law in the New Deal era. We'll talk about that. And we're in the middle of a fight today, of course, very vividly splashed on the front pages of the newspaper with the Biden infrastructure bill about whether these kinds of things, care is infrastructure. One point of law and political economy scholarship and of a course like this is that to help us think about, we want to be able to, we're here, in fact, to think about how we should govern the economy to make it more just and democratic, to make our world more sustainable. And given that, interrogating what we mean by the economy and its relationship to race and gender, and in fact, thinking about questions like this question of care and undoing dynamics of racialized extraction, those have to be seen as not peripheral, but central to the project that we're going to undertake. So we'll be trying to find ways to weave in those questions over the course of our discussions. All right, a fourth critical move of LPE. We need to think dynamically about how legal changes impact power, so that there's this dynamic influence between law and political economy at different stages in time. So if you just do what law and economics scholars might tell you to do, let's move distribution later and just maximize efficiency, then guess what? You're likely to have entrenched power that is going to entrench itself further in politics. So if that's how you see things, and we flip that story, then you need a primary commitment to much more widely distributed and less concentrated political and economic power if we're going to have a democracy. So perhaps we ought to be thinking about redistribution of political power of democracy in a genuine, materially inflected way is coming first in a democracy. We don't allow people to sell votes. That might tell us something about what we think about the proper relationship between exchanges and wealth maximization principles and democracy. All right, a fifth critical move in law and political economy. Democratizing the economy requires challenging technocratic management tools and ideas. Tools like public choice theory, which I mentioned, cost-benefit analysis, at least in its current form, and hopefully we'll have the chance to discuss that a bit more later in our conversations. So challenging the idea of public choice, that a state can't be, in fact, a source of a space where we make claims that are different than those that we have as consumers, but that embody forms of public value, acts of kind of moral and collective social constitution, right? Embodying ourselves and becoming ourselves as a political people. So that's the last critical move that I want to just then put out there, that if we want to democratize the economy, and then thinking broadly about what we're doing in the AMRI course, we don't just want to replace one bad set of technocratic management tools with a good set of technocratic management tools, but we also want to challenge the very notion that that the issues that we're talking about can be fully adjudicated in technical or technocratic ways. So I think what I hope you can see now together is the way the sort of thread of these neoliberal ideas, which are coming from scholarship, but also very much being pumped into the sphere of public discourse in a particular way by people with money and interests, help to create the set of legal changes that we'll be talking about over the next several weeks. Changes across all areas of law that tend to concentrate inequality and corporate power, increase inequality, and undermine the tools and traditions and values of the state, which in earlier periods, in fact, were more robust. Whether that's tools like labor law or consumer protection. So what I wanted you to do is sort of see some of the ways that neoliberalism gets connected into law through law and economics, and helps encase then markets from democratic control. What we want to do instead in this course is develop a set of positive claims, a different way of asking questions that we can see as not just academic methods, but practically useful modalities to allow us to kind of create a framework for certain kinds of change that we want to see in the world. So what are some of these alternative moves? What's beyond this neoliberal approach, and in fact, beyond critique? What's our reconstructive set of moves? So we talk about this in the very end of the paper, and so I won't dwell on it at length here, but we suggest that there's several. There's the move from efficiency and centering and valuing efficiency to talking predominantly about power. So rather than ask what's efficient, we should be asking who has the power to decide what, to whom, and how can we distribute power more broadly, especially to people who have been so long excluded and marginalized, and who need to be included under any proper definition of a democracy. So we need to see that law acts on power in many ways and try to more widely distribute power at different levels. And there's different kinds of power that we should focus on. So what do we mean by power? Well, law creates constitutive power. Who has the property entitlement? What's a nuisance, right? Who gets to pollute? There's constitutive power that we should be paying attention to. We should also pay attention to market power. So obviously market power is a lot of what we discussed in our last class and lecture. And market power, I think that last class has begun to suggest for us, is everywhere. Markets, perhaps under current economic conditions, may even incline toward market power and rents. The implications of that, I think, are very substantial, right? And for example, right, if markets incline toward power rather than, as law and economics and neoclassical economics suggested, dissipating power by competition, then management has power, right? So workers can't adequately discipline employers by leaving. The firm and its specificity matters again. So more efficient firms won't simply replace less efficient ones. Firm culture matters, management choices matter. We might say we have a return to the moral economy, right? Where we can talk coherently again about the morality of the economy in multiple registers, including the moral choices of people who operate in the economy. So that's market power and new suppositions we might make about market power. We should also think about political power and its relationship to economic power and this dynamic relationship, right? And we need a politics. We mentioned this in the paper, and it's a very lively area of discussion in LPE scholarship of non-reformist reforms focused on power building, particularly for people who, again, have been historically marginalized, extracted, and those who need more power if they're going to be full citizens, whether that's people who work in waged and unwaged ways, people of color, women, and so forth. So that's the first big move, from a focus on efficiency to a focus on power and its distribution and its facets. The second is moving away from a kind of ideological claim to neutrality towards an emphasis on equality. So instead of the idea that we prioritize efficiency because it's neutral, instead we prioritize equality. And one way to think about this might be to posit that instead of saying, well, let's first do the efficient thing and then let distribution happen, instead we say, let's assume that redistribution won't happen, that distributions are sticky. So distribution at time one won't be redistributed at time two, especially in the presence of concentrated power. So because of this, ongoing attention to building countervailing power is going to be critical. And we're going to need major redistributive dynamics. And those dynamics are going to require substantial countervailing power where experts are probably not in the lead. So we also, of course, I'm thinking here about the conversation earlier about integrating our theories of political economy with critical race theory, with feminist theory. We want to think here intersectionally about equality, focusing on structural exclusion, and thinking about the intersections of different forms of inequality and marginalization. And against the sort of false neutrality of efficiency talk, we want to return to a tradition of more classical political economy. So focusing on the kind of moral economy we want to build and what its implications for shared political life would be. So we think equality and democracy are better principles. So then as efficiency as a sort of a claim for our kind of that are morally persuasive. So the question should be, what kind of economy do we want to build? What entitlements should we have? How should we regulate markets if we value democracy and equality and not efficiency? All right. The third move is from anti-politics to democracy. There's a broad way of describing neoliberalism and its power, and in fact, its appeal as anti-political. We're just doing efficiency here. We're just going to let the technical experts operate, and we're going to zone off and wall these things off from politics. So instead of that, which hasn't worked out very well, we think, we argue that we should reject the idea of anti-politics, and in fact, also the idea of public choice theory, that the government is a market, that it can't work well because it's a kind of monopolist or the subject of interest group bargaining, and instead develop really serious attempts to think about how to make the state work better. And of course, in our conversations about regulating industry, this is going to be front and center, right? We need a theory and we need work on, and we have some of it and we need more of it, that I'm going to call a theory of the sort of developmental state. How we regulate, how in fact states do and can have good information about regulating markets, how they might instead manage to make decisions, whether about property rights or coordination rights or breaking companies up in a way that do respond to democratic values and that are kind of susceptible to political control rather than kind of deferred control to experts in anti-politics. So we'll be talking about examples of how this can be done and the best ways to do it. So we want to argue for sort of embracing democracy and not a kind of neoliberal technocracy. That doesn't mean avoiding all uses of economics. You'll see we have economics in our midst, economists in our midst, and there are some tools that we might take from that. But it does mean kind of resisting the idea of a sort of just turning all these decisions over to either economists or to other technical experts, and think about democratizing administration and decision making. So the last thing I want to do is just sort of put up a slide that I hope might summarize some of this for you. So this is my one-stop shopping summary of what I just talked to you about. So markets are not natural, but are constructed by law. We decide in politics what kind of markets we want. Efficiency is not neutral. It enacts an accession principle and makes the rich richer and concentrates economic power. Economic power is inextricably connected to the development of racial and gender hierarchies, as well as to other systems of unequal power and privilege. Politics and the economy dynamically constitute one another, and changes in law impact politics and the economy at the next stage. So if we want equality and we want democracy, we have to build it into politics and the economy. And then last, that democratizing the economy requires challenging technocratic management tools and ideas like cost-benefit analysis and public choice. And I'm going to just suggest here, too, that there's some, that these lead to some of the critical moves. So the fact that markets aren't natural, but are constructed by law, that moving constructively instead to think about law and politics rather than just simply deferring to markets, to deciding in law and politics what kind of markets we want. Moving from efficiency to power and an analysis of power and how to bring about the power, sort of distributed forms of power that are important to democracy. Focusing on equality. So instead of these sort of to take apart the gender and race hierarchies and forms of subordination and other systems of unequal power and privilege, but also working from a sort of vision where we always defer equality to later, to bringing it up center and in fact perhaps first. And last is sort of displacing technocratic management tools and ideals of neutrality with a risky embrace of democracy. All right, that is well enough for today. And let me just close down that share. And thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in class this week.